Good evening. Glad to see everybody here. I know it's kind of a smaller crowd, but that's all right. We got quality over quantity. So, so as mentioned last week, um, the last few Wednesdays of this month is just going to be kind of blitz weeks where the teacher can introduce a topic, and it's not really anything that builds off of another, but a lesson nonetheless. And last week I discussed the table of nations in Genesis chapter 10. And this week I thought about trying to do something that will lead into the next quarter. This next quarter on Wednesday nights, we're going to be doing a class on evangelism. And if you recall, on the past few months, on certain Sundays, we talk about the hands of Jesus. Jesus has the hands of a carpenter, he has the hands of a fisherman, physician, and all these things. But one that we haven't discussed that's really one of his biggest qualities is he has the hands of a master teacher. And I thought about how to go about teaching an evangelism class, and there's many different ways that you can do it, and it's not really a wrong way of doing it these ways, but rather than talking about the different methods, like talking about back to the Bible and how that works, and the fishers of men and that program and how to approach it that way, or how to do door knocking, I'm not going to discuss any of that. What I'm going to do with the evangelism class this next quarter, this coming quarter, is we're going to look at evangelism at the approach of how Jesus did it. And we're going to discuss what it means to be a teacher, what it means to be a student, because Jesus, when he came to earth, there are about 40 plus, there are about 40 plus different discussions between Jesus and an individual or individuals, but 90% of those interactions were one-on-one. Jesus, even though he taught and preached to great multitudes, 90% of his conversations were what we would consider a one-on-one Bible study. Not that he had a method here, like a little booklet, and then he had his New King James Bible here, and it's like, we're going to talk about this topic, and we're going to talk about baptism. He simply was a walking Bible. I mean, he was the Word, John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And the Word became flesh. But even though he was God in the flesh, John chapter 1 and verse 14, he grew in stature and in wisdom and in favor in the eyes of both man and God. Which means, even though he was deity, he made himself a servant and put himself in a position where he could learn. Not that he didn't know anything before, but becoming a human being, he experienced everything that we experience, yet without sin, as the Hebrew writer would say. And so when he was even at a young age, he asked questions. He wanted to know more. And for the Jewish culture, specifically with the Jewish men, they would focus on the children, specifically the young boys, from the age of 5 all the way up to age 30. They would teach them the law of Moses. They would have to memorize the Pentateuch, which is all first 5 books of the Old Testament. They would have to memorize the Psalms, all 150 of them. And they would have to memorize all of the Proverbs, all 31 chapters. They had to memorize all of those things and understand them with the help of rabbis, teachers, and their father. The first 5 years of their life was given to the mother. The mother was to teach them how to be a man, how to respect authority. But at that point, once they were prepared at the age of 5 of you respect authority, this is what it means to be a man, they were handed over to their father, and the father said, I'm going to build upon this foundation that your mother has taught you, and we're going to learn the authority of God. Well, that's exactly what Jesus did for his entire life while here on earth, especially the 30 years of learning. And when he became a rabbi, a teacher, the master teacher, He started his ministry at the age of 30, which is what the Jewish men would have done. John the Baptist, same thing. He began teaching around the age of 30. Well, the reason Jesus was so good at teaching was because, one, he's God. I understand that. But at the same time, he knew how to deal with people. And a lot of people can argue, and rightfully so, well, he could read the hearts of men. I understand that. He's God, but he's also man, which means even though he has all power and all authority and all knowledge as God, he still experienced everything that we experienced as a human. And in, the book of 1 Peter, specifically the end of chapter 2, it says, he left us an example to follow in his footsteps. And that does not just mean how to live a life of godliness. It also means he left us an example of how to teach a life of godliness. Jesus taught with authority. And the reason I'm telling you all of this, because we're going to be discussing it next quarter of how to be like the master teacher. What I'm going to do, Lord willing, tonight and possibly next Wednesday night, is we're going to do an introduction to the book of John. And the reason I want to do this is because this is going to be an introduction to our class for next quarter, talking about who Jesus is, the witnesses that are mentioned in the book of John, because remember, what were the 90% of the conversations that Jesus had? They were one-on-one. A lot of those are found in the book of John. He approaches Nicodemus, or Nicodemus approaches him. He approaches the woman at the well. He has one-on-one conversations with his disciples. He has conversations with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And if you look at all of these different interactions, you will see that he knew how to approach them based off of where they were, spiritually speaking, where their knowledge was, their background, and their maturity. And if you notice, with the sinners, that is the prostitutes and the tax collectors and all of those individuals, he was patient with them. And he would rebuke harshly the Pharisees. And that's why the Pharisees got upset, because they're saying, you should be rebuking them. Well, if you look at Jesus' approach, he had a reason for why he did everything. Everything that Jesus did was strategic, and it was all to glorify God in the process. The way he approached people, the way he approached Scripture, the way he approached teaching, and the way he approached preaching. Even his miracles, he did it strategically to glorify God and to prove the Word. Mark chapter 16 and verse 20. Now, in the book of John, what we're going to do is it's just going to be an overview of the book of John, an introduction. And in this introduction, I want us to look at the message. We're going to look at key words and themes. We're going to look at the historical background of the book of John, who the audience is. It's almost going to be as if we're going to study the book of John. But in studying the book of John, we're going to be looking at how Jesus taught, okay? So in our introduction, what I first want to look at is the message of the book. Now, John is considered a gospel account, and there's 4 of them. You've got Matthew, you've got Mark, you've got Luke, and you've got John. Now, why on earth do we have 4 different accounts? They're all the same gospel. It's not that there's 4 gospels. There's 4 accounts of the gospel. Okay, so you've got 4 different groups of people. And in these 4 different accounts of the same gospel, we're going to do this. What is the gospel? All right. The gospel is the good news, which means even though there's 4 different accounts, they're all pointing to this. But it's kind of like, I don't know if this is the best analogy to use or not. Let's say that there is a wreck on the side of the road, and you've got 4 different people who saw it. You've got a doctor, you've got a cosmetologist, you've got a carpenter, and you've got, let's see, a fisherman. And the police show up, and those 4 individuals are there, and they start questioning these individuals who witnessed this car accident or this car crash. What do you think that the account, all 4 are going to say the same thing. They're going to say that this is what happened, but do you think that there are things that might stand out to them based off of their background? Different perspective. So it's not that they're telling a different story. It may be that the cosmetologist sees that the car was once this color, but we can tell that it's now been burnt due to this color, or you see that the fisherman noticed that the person driving was also a fisherman. He doesn't really focus more on the car as much as he noticed that I know that this guy's a fisherman because of the gear that he has. It's specifically for fishing. And then you've got the engineer, or the engineer, the one that would work on machines. What do you think he will focus on? The mechanical damage. And then you've got the lawyer. What do you think the lawyer will be focusing on? Yeah, who's at fault? So even though they're all telling the same story, they're picking up different aspects of the story. Now, because there's 4 different accounts with different backgrounds, Matthew was what? Okay, he was a Jew, so he's focusing in on the Jewish people. Mark, who did he focus on? I always get Mark and Luke mixed up. It's the Romans, yeah. Mark focuses on the Romans. Luke, who does he focus on? He focuses on the Greeks. Now, if you do any study on an overview of the gospel accounts, you will notice that the book of John is very unique in nature, because these focus on a very specific type of people, and even in their types of writing, they're very similar. John is completely different. What's the argument called that some people say that these individuals stole from each other, but John isn't a part of that? I forget that argument. There's some kind of term for it. Well, these are so similar that because of people who don't want to acknowledge the inspiration of the Bible, they'll say that they're so similar that they just stole each other's material. That's not true. They won't group John in because John is so different in his approach to the gospel account. Who is John writing to? He's writing to the whole world. Now, I know I said I was doing an introduction to the book of John, and we are. That's why I'm spreading it out to 2 classes, because I want to focus on the general and then narrow in on the specific. Because Matthew is talking to the Jews, what were the Jews expecting? Okay, so they were expecting the Messiah, which really, I think that's Hebrew, Messiah or Meshech, which means anointed one. They were looking for a king. So Matthew, because they have a skewed perspective of what the Messiah is, he talks about the kingship of Christ. Now, the Romans is very interesting. Romans, if you look at their background and their history, they were more action-packed. They had a small attention span. Even their religion was really just an adoption of the Greeks, because even though they had their belief system and their faith, it wasn't really that organized. So when they overtook the Greeks were more philosophical, and they thought about things. They were great thinkers. They were not great fighters. I know we know about Alexander the Great, who was Greek, but after he died, there's a reason why the Roman Empire came in after Alexander the Great died. Greeks were more thinkers and philosophical. Romans, we fight. We are bred for fighting. Well, because they're fighters, what do you think somebody that's going to be in the military is going to be focused on? If you have somebody whose attention span is about the size of a gnat, they're probably not going to read a book about this big. If you notice, Mark's account is the smallest account. And what does Mark focus on? Mark has the most accounts and records of demon possession, of miracles. It's action-packed. It shows the power of Jesus, but even though he's full of power, it talks about his servanthood. So the Romans, their gods are full of action and full of war. You've got the god of war. You've got the god of wine. You've got all of these different gods and goddesses who really are human-like in their desires, but they're just supernatural humans. They're imperfect. They're sinful, according to the Scriptures, but they've got supernatural powers. Mark comes along and says, let me tell you about a God who's more powerful than them, and he shows them through the demonic possessions and through the miracles, but he's humble. You know, in the mind of a Roman, a God that would put themselves below their creation was unheard of. In fact, the gods of the Romans would use their creation as pawns to get what they wanted. But in the book of Mark, we see that Jesus, who is deity, he shows his servanthood. He came to wash the disciples' feet, not use them as pawns for his great gain. And then we made mention of Luke. He's focusing on the Greeks who are more philosophical. He's specifically writing to Theophilus, who is a Greek. And Luke, very interesting, what is his background? He's what? Doctor, physician. So we've got Dr. Luke here, who's writing to the Greeks. And what does Luke focus on? Because if you notice the Greeks' background and their what they taught and what their philosophy was, specifically Socrates. Socrates is a good example of kind of where their mindset is. They wanted to know what happened after death. They wanted to know the connection between man and God. They were, what is truth? They were deep thinkers. Well, Luke is writing to Greeks, really answering how the supernatural is connected to the physical. And so with his background being a doctor, what do you think he's going to talk to the Greeks about concerning Jesus? Okay, he talks a lot about his birth. I know Matthew talks a lot about his birth, but he really focuses on his genealogy. You actually get a historical beginning of the book of Luke that talks about the birth of John the Baptist leading up. So Greeks, they wanted the entire picture. They wanted to have the knowledge. Well, because they were always thinking about the supernatural and the higher powers, Luke says, I'm going to tell you about his humanity. And what better way to have one write about humanity than a doctor? He talks about Christ's human nature. Even though he's deity, you need to be thinking of Jesus also that he was flesh. He was the Son of Man that's mentioned tons of times throughout the book of Luke. He focuses on Christ's humanity. Now, you've got his kingship, you've got his servanthood, you've got his humanity, but then you also, even though he was human, John is talking to the entire world discussing what? The Son of God. Even though he's the Son of Man, he is the Son of God. So he talks about Christ's divinity. And if you notice this could actually be grouped into two different groups. You've got Christ's role. He is going to be a leader, but he's also going to be a servant. He is going to lead by example. And then you've got the second part, which is his nature. Even though he is human, he is also God. And because all four of these things, we've got good news that because he is our king, and because he is humble enough to serve us, and because he is both human and deity, we can have salvation. It is only through somebody who can fulfill these roles perfectly that we can have the good news. Isaiah chapter 52, verses 1 through 7, it says that how beautiful are the feet that bring good news of good tidings. The good news is the death, burial, and resurrection and ascension of Jesus the Christ. The only way he can do those things is if he was both human and man, and by ascending into heaven, he went from being a servant to now being anointed as king. That's the gospel. That is the four different aspects of the gospel: Christ's authority, Christ's humility, Christ's humanity, and Christ's divinity. Now, in all four of these, we're going to have these three in the back of our mind, but we're going to be focusing in on an introduction to the book of John, his divinity. Now, here's some key words in the book of John. Knowing that the book of John is about Christ's divinity, his, you could say godship. That's not really a word, but we'll make it a word for tonight. His godship, him being deity. You've got three, there's a lot of key words, but three really stand out throughout the entire book of John. You've got the word testimony, okay? The word testimony is mentioned about 29 different times, and you can really see it in the Greek. The Greek word is martus. That's the Greek word. In the English translations, it's mentioned as testimony in the ESV 29 times. And in the King James Version, it's mentioned 21 to 22 times as testimony in the English word. But the Greek word martus, testimony, is mentioned 29 times total. Now, do you notice any familiar word in the word martus? I think the "us" is kind of throwing it off. Does it sound similar to any English word that we have? Martyr. That's the Greek word for testimony is where we get our English word martyr. Now, why is that? Well, why were people martyred? They made testimonies about things, and when they were threatened to be put to death, they said, we're going to stand by our testimony. We have no choice but to stand on this because it's the truth. That's why Christianity, that is true Christianity, the Church of Christ, is the one religion that cannot be snuffed out because it is not built on a lie. Somebody is not going to die for a lie, at least if they know it's a lie. The apostles knew who Jesus was, and they knew that if I continue down this path, I'm going to be martyred. And that's fine. In fact, I hope that it happens because that means that I am counted worthy to suffer humiliation for the cause of Christ. Exactly, which for a testimony, that word is more used in the court of law. What is a testimony? When you think of testimony, what do you think of? A witness. You think of eyewitnesses. You think of something that can support as evidence. What I think is and you're going to laugh at me, the book of John is one of my favorite books of the Bible because the reason it's written so differently from the other three accounts. These three, Matthew is written almost like a resume of who Jesus, he meets the qualifications for a king. Mark is written almost like an action-packed movie. In fact, there's a phrase that he makes, I think it's like 15 to 25 different times, and immediately this happened. That's what he says. And immediately blank, 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 blank happened. So he does a scene and says, and then immediately this happened. He wants to keep the attention of the Romans. Immediately this happened. Immediately he cast out demons. So it's written almost like an action-packed movie. The book of Luke is written like a philosophical conversation. because he's talking to one person. But the book of John is written so unique because it's written almost like a court case. Now, what I mean by that, I love movies and TV shows that's like Law and Order. I used to watch them all the time with my grandmother, Granny B. Her name was Brenda. She passed away about 10 years ago, and one of my fondest memories was being able to watch Law and Order or Murder, She Wrote with popcorn. And something that always fascinated me was the language that they used. When they would come into the courtroom, and then they would, now you're going to have this witness come to the stand, and you're going to make you're going to tell your testimony, and do you swear on the Bible? Yes, I swear, so help me God. And then you've got their story, and then at the very end, everything comes out that this is in fact true, and these are the lies. This person's guilty, and this person's innocent. So at the very end, you see who truly was innocent and who truly was guilty based off of evidence and the eyewitnesses. This is exactly how the book of John is written. And the way you can organize this book is as follows. I like to call this the theological flow of the book of John. The theological flow of the book of John starts out with the defendant. Okay? Chapter 1, verses 1 through 28. In chapter 1, verses 1 through 28, you read about the defendant. Now, who is the defendant? Who's being put on trial here? Jesus the Christ. In chapter 1, what you have is an introduction to who Jesus is. John is writing. He's the stenographer. So you know the little old lady that's sitting in the back that's always doing this right here in the Law and Order TV shows? That's the stenographer. She's making note of absolutely everything that's said and everything that's being put forward as evidence. She's recording everything. John is the stenographer. He's writing down everything. And he introduces the case of the Messiah, the case of the Christ, by saying, we're going to first introduce the defendant. This is who he claims to be. This is who he says that he is. And how does John describe him? The very first 5 verses. Okay. He is described as the Word. He's described as being the beginning, which really shows his divinity. He's described as, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. He was described as the Creator. What else? Verses 4 through what? The light. Okay, so he's described as the light. He's described as, because he is the light, he is the what over the darkness. What does he do with the darkness? He expels it. So he is the, let's see, how do I have that worded here? Dispels. Yeah, the defeater of darkness, that's it. Defeater of darkness. But that's just the first 5 verses. We go all the way through verse 28. He's describing who Jesus is, the defeater of darkness. How else is he described? But even though he's described as God, verse 14, what else is he described as? Human. Flesh. So you see that he's actually bringing in the other 3 gospel accounts and saying this is an overview of who Jesus is. And if you read through the end of the chapter, you actually not only get a description of Jesus through the stenographer, John, but you get John the Baptist, a different John, who says, I have come to prepare the way for what? Okay. He's prepared the way for who? It's like it's right there. You want to say it, but for some reason you just don't want to say it. I have come to prepare the way for the Lord. So I want you to look at this list. You've got the Word, which we'll discuss what this means here in a minute. You've got God, which shows His divinity, His divine nature. His Creator, which is being the Creator, that shows what about Jesus? His power. You've got the light, which shows what? Knowledge. Well, it's within the context of defeating the darkness. So, what is light usually a reference of? Light, holiness, sanctification. Not enlightenment, because enlightenment kind of carries with the idea of coming to the knowledge of. I am enlightened. I have the knowledge of. Salvation. Think of purity. Why didn't you say it? So you've got the light, which shows His purity. You've got darkness that is overpowering over darkness. What does that show? If you have beaten something, what have you shown? Victory. Conquering. Okay, so you've got victory, and I would say, I just had it. I want to say either authority or dominance. You could supremacy. That's the word I'm looking for. He is superior. The superiority of Christ. Oh man, superior. Ignore that. Flesh, that shows His what? Exactly. So if Him being light, therefore something else can exist, darkness. Well, the flesh, what does that show? Humanity. And then Lord, if you look at, John the Baptist is quoting Isaiah 40. I said Isaiah 52 just a while ago. It's Isaiah 40, verses 1 through 7. He's quoting Isaiah 40, verses 1 through 7, talking about the prophecy of the herald that's coming. Well, what normally has a herald? A herald has something to say, specifically preparing the place for what? A king. So you've got, I am preparing the way for the Lord, which is showing Christ's what? Kingship. So in the first chapter, John says we are putting the Word, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. You're putting God, you're putting the power, you're putting the purest entity, the victory and superior one, the one who is human and king, on trial. This is who is being put on trial. Now, why did I leave word blank? The Greek word is logos. Logos, or that's the Greek, logos, had two different meanings depending on the culture, specifically Jew and Greek. To the Jew, the word logos, or logos means something that is eternal. It is a knowledge. Logos simply means knowledge, but it carried with it to the Jews an eternal knowledge. It was a supreme knowledge. To the Greeks, which was Koine Greek, to the Greeks, the philosophers, they considered logos, wisdom, as something that is full of. They wanted to be filled with knowledge. They wanted to talk about everything and come to ultimate knowledge. And so logos to the Greeks, who were philosophers, meant something that is saturated with knowledge. So when he's writing to the entire world, both Jew and Greek, he's saying that Jesus is the logos. He is the eternal and saturated wisdom. He is the wisdom that always has been and that will be, and He has all of the knowledge. All the knowledge that you want, that's Jesus. And so in the first 28 verses, He introduces who the defendant is. Now, if I'm looking at this court case and I see who the defendant is, I probably am going to be scared seeing that he is being put on trial as guilty. Because that's the whole point of this, is it not? what's the verdict? Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen this episode. Who is Jesus guilty or is he not guilty in the eyes of the Jews? The verdict is he's guilty and his sentence is hang until dead, but not by the neck, the cruelest way of hanging, which is crucifixion. So you've got bookended, the perfect innocent entity is found guilty for the most heinous crime and should be punished as such. And so right in the middle of all of this, you've got the rest of the court case. This is just the introduction to the book of John. John, the stenographer, says this is who's being put on trial. Then you've got the actual court case. John says, here's the defendant. Let's start bringing in the witnesses. There are 21 different witnesses, give or take. Some of them are eyewitnesses, actual eyewitnesses, such as John the Baptist, Nicodemus, the woman at the well. Then you have eyewitnesses, or really they're considered evidence, Exhibit A, Exhibit B, which are the miracles. The miracles, if you notice throughout the book of John, are a little bit different. Not necessarily different in the sense of they're not mentioned in the other accounts, but John focuses in on specific miracles that prove that Jesus is the Son of God. Because if you were to try and find the meaning of the book of John, I would probably go to John chapter 20 and verse 31. It's very hard to find the meaning of certain books, but when a writer says, I am writing these things, it's pretty obvious what the purpose of the book is. Paul would say in 1 Timothy chapter 3, I am writing these things to you so that you may know how to conduct yourself in the Lord's church. The purpose of the book of 1 Timothy is to know how to conduct yourself in the Lord's body. The book of John, the purpose of this writing, what does John say he is writing this book for? That you might believe, which by the way, the word believe, pisteuo, is mentioned 108 times throughout the entire book of John. The whole point of the book of John is to prove what Jesus says that he is in fact true. And the stenographer is recording everything, all of the witnesses, all of the testimonies, the true witnesses, the false witnesses, and saying, I am writing these things so that the entire world can read it, and that by believing the evidence that is put forward, we might have what? Eternal life in his name, by his authority. And I find it interesting how John says, I'm writing these things so that by his authority, you might have eternal life, his authority being that he is the Son of God, and they're putting him to death because he's claiming to be the Son of God. That's blasphemous. So they're putting him to death for the very thing that's actually fixing to save them. Kind of ironic. Yes, ma'am. Rochelle, did you have your hand up? Oh, sorry. Calling you out. So the witnesses, there are about 21 different witnesses, and I was going to try and write them on the board, but if you want, I've got a list of them here. You can take a picture of it later. But there's 21 different witnesses, and the witnesses usually, and by the way, the reason we're doing all of this introduction is because the witnesses is what we're really going to be studying this next quarter. How did Jesus approach these witnesses to where he convinced them that he is the Son of God? That's the whole point of being evangelistic, is to prove that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, so that you can convict them through the word of God so that they can believe it, and that by believing they might have what? John chapter 20 and verse 31, eternal life in his name. So we're giving this introduction of who Jesus is, so when we start our evangelism class, it's not just, well, I know how to evangelize, it's I know the purpose of evangelism. I now have a purpose of having difficult conversations. I now have a purpose of approaching somebody that I love who is lost. And I know it's going to be a hard conversation to have, and I might even be rejected by them, but at least I know why I'm doing it. One reason why people have a hard time evangelizing is because they don't have the right motivation. They don't have the right motivation. they don't have the proper training, and they don't know how to use the tools that have been given to them. Those are the three main issues for why people make excuses, and that's just that, an excuse for why they cannot evangelize, which is hogwash, by the way. Everybody can evangelize, whether it's one-on-one or great multitudes. Jesus gives an example of how to do both and says, I was able to bring out individuals from Galilee who were fishermen, who were dishonest zealots or tax collectors, who were violent zealots, that was what we would consider radical assassins. I was able to bring all of these people together and teach them how to evangelize. Have you ever looked at the background behind the apostles? Oh, I only get one bell, don't I, on Wednesday night? Man, that's frustrating. Anyway, what we'll do next week, Lord willing, is we're going to pick up in the outline and the breakdown of the entire book, the theological flow of the book. So here you go. I'm not going to give you the witnesses. What I want you to do, look, it's only 6 chapters. So chapter 1, verses 29 through chapter 6 and verse 21, you will see 21 witnesses. Chapter 1, 29 through chapter 6, 21, I want you to read those chapters and find the 21 witnesses. And I'll give you a hint. They're humans, they're writings, and they're miracles. They're those three. Okay? And here's a, you want the hint again? Okay. The hint is the witnesses are human beings, they're inspired writings, and they are miraculous works that prove that Jesus is who he says that he is. And here's another hint. I'm throwing you bones. I'm essentially throwing you an entire skeleton here. I might as well just throw the meat on it. 3 of those human ones are the same person. Isn't reading the Bible fun? All right, any questions or comments before we close this evening? Chapter 1, verse 29 through chapter 6 and verse 27. And remind me, because I'm just going to start back up in the outline. I'll probably forget. You are going to have to tell me, hey, we found some witnesses, and we'll list them. And if we're lacking some, then we'll go back and look at them. Okay. So next week, we'll have the last class of the quarter, and then we'll have one last Wednesday, which is our singing night and devotional night. And then the following Wednesday, we should pick up with our evangelism class. So we'll probably just have time to look at the outline of the book and look at the witnesses, which is really the purpose of these 2 classes. All right, thank you.
Sure. Man,